In your story, your main character is going to pursue a goal. For instance, winning a boxing championship. Whether or not the protagonist achieves that goal is going to be answered toward the end of your story in the climax. Even though your story is building up to that answer, it shouldn't be the only dramatic question that the audience follows. Your story is going to have a beginning, middle, and end, and each of those should have its own dramatic question that the audience is going to get invested in as the story builds towards the big climax towards the end. An act is a tool you could use to provide structure to the beginning, middle, and end to keep your audience invested in the ups and downs of the story as you approach the climax. A premise is a one-sentence overview of your story. It should mention your main character, the main conflict that character goes up against, and ideally, a contradiction. So in that boxing story I was talking about before, a premise could be a washed-up boxer tries to win the World Heavyweight Championship against the best fighter in history. So we've got a main character, the washed-up boxer, the main conflict trying to win the championship, and then a contradiction. We have a washed-up fighter versus the best fighter ever. So you're going to want to start there. In the beginning of the story, the dramatic question would be, can this washed-up boxer find a trainer? The beginning of the story is going to follow the main character as he goes through ups and downs trying to find a trainer. We're then going to move into the second act, which is going to cover the middle of the story. And that act would have the dramatic question, can this boxer get in good enough shape to take on the champ? So he's found a trainer. Now he's going through the ups and downs of training, getting ready for that big climatic fight. And then in the third act, which is going to cover the end, we go into the question of, can the boxer who's been injured through the story win the fight against the champ? So everything is building up towards whether or not the boxer is going to achieve his goal, but we have drama along the way. So the audience isn't just sitting there waiting for that end scene. The audience is going to get very emotionally invested in the ups and downs of the boxer getting a trainer, then training, and then finally fighting. An obstacle is any type of conflict a character runs into in your story. Now, the key to creating obstacles is to make sure that the character's situation before the obstacle in some way changes after the character confronts the obstacle. And that change should be either an up or a down, a positive or a negative. For example, let's say we have a thriller and a character needs to get out of a building, and that building is filled with bad guys. The character has a knife and comes up against a bad guy that has a gun. That's an obstacle. When they get into a fight, if the character winds up getting shot in the leg, his situation has changed in a negative way. So he's worse off after the obstacle than he was before. On the other hand, let's say that fight led to the character winning. He now could take the gun off of the bad guy. His situation has gotten better. He came into the fight with just a knife. Now he has a gun. as your characters run into obstacles, that the result of those obstacles should change the trajectory your characters move through the story. I like to look at this like a pinball machine. The ball is moving, knocks into an obstacle, gets thrown a different direction. The ball hits another obstacle, and again, gets thrown another way. In the example I was just talking about with the character who has a knife that comes up against the bad guy with a gun, in the variation where the character gets shot in the leg, that's going to change the trajectory that character is moving through the story. That character now needs to get some sort of medical attention for the leg, even if it's really makeshift. That character is going to face the next obstacle, and that obstacle is going to have to do with first aid for the leg. In the example where the character defeats the bad guy with the gun and then takes the gun, that would also change the trajectory of that character moving through the story. So now that the character has a gun, he may feel emboldened to take a riskier path through the building that he's trying to escape from. People always talk about how much they love fast-paced stories. But what does that actually mean, a fast-paced story? You might think it involves a story with a lot of action. Fights, car chases, scenes like that. But actually, it has to do with how quickly a writer gives the audience a definitive piece of information that's an up or a down for a main character as they build towards the answer to a dramatic question. For instance, let's say we have a crime story about a cop pursuing a robber. If the entire story was just one car chase, even if the cars were going really fast, that might get pretty boring pretty quickly if we just saw two cars on a road driving. Now, if there were various obstacles that the cop and the robber ran into on the road, and their positions changed and the advantages changed, that would be more interesting. The main character cop would be getting a stream of ups and downs, and the audience would be processing those and feel more invested to the story as they were getting little exciting pieces of information along the way. That being said, if the story just had one dramatic question, can the cop catch the robber in a car chase, the story would start to feel pretty stale, even if there were ups and downs. So, by having multiple dramatic questions in a story, it allows the writer to structure ups and downs in different arenas, and they're going to feel a lot fresher because they're building towards the answers to different questions. So instead of just having one chase, we might see the cop investigating and trying to figure out who the criminal is, and then pursuing the criminal in the criminal's lair, whatever that might be. And then after a dramatic escape from the lair, the cop chases the criminal on the road. Each of those different arenas will have its own dramatic question and its own ups and downs. In our boxing story, Act 1's dramatic question is whether or not the boxer can find a trainer. So to keep this act fast-paced, we're going to want to give the audience a lot of ups and downs as the boxer tries to find a trainer. So for instance, at the beginning of the act, the boxer could go back to his former trainer that he used to have success with. But when the boxer visits him, we notice that this trainer is now a full-blown alcoholic. He's a mess. There's no way he could do his former job. That's going to be a down. The audience, seeing that, is going to get a bit of excitement, even though It's a negative for the main character that the audience is rooting for. There's excitement because the challenge ahead for that main character just got more complicated. After the boxer fails with his old trainer, he's then gonna look up the most renowned trainer that's working today. He's gonna meet with this person. Even though the trainer is mentally all there and has a really good record of success, their styles don't really mesh. They butt heads in another dramatic scene, and the boxer storms out feeling insulted. They don't work together. So now we have another down that's very definitive that the audience got. The best working trainer will not take on the boxer. The boxer then goes back to the gym, is working out, and in the background is this young, shy kid that mops up the gym. He's a really lowly worker, but he hangs around there all the time. As the boxer is training, this kid gives him a one-off comment about his technique, says it in a really quiet voice. The boxer is intrigued by this because the comment is really insightful. It's something that the boxer hasn't yet heard, something that this famous renowned trainer didn't even notice. The boxer then starts talking to this kid, and we find out that the kid, from working in the gym, has been studying boxing, is really smart, just very shy, so doesn't communicate that well, and has become really skillful in analyzing fights. The boxer decides to take a chance on this kid and make this young guy with no experience his trainer while trying to win the World Heavyweight Championship. So now we have an up. The audience gets that information. The boxer did find a trainer. The dramatic question of Act 1 is answered on an up. And throughout, the audience was getting little bits of exciting information, keeping them invested. So as you could see, even though this is a boxing story, there were no fights. There were no boxing matches in Act 1, but it still feels fast-paced because we're giving the audience information, we're taking them up, we're taking them down, and we're keeping them invested in the story. At the beginning of your first act, you're going to want to start introducing characters. Definitely your protagonist, and then probably some allies as well. These are the characters that help your protagonist achieve their goal. So to do that, you're going to want to learn how to characterize, which is painting a picture of what a character is like in life. I like to look at 3 different dimensions while I do this: the physical, the mental, and the cultural. When I say physical, I mean the physical traits of this character. Are they tall or short? Are they attractive or plain? Are they strong or frail? Mental refers to the psychological traits of this character. Are they witty or kind of slow? Are they composed or very antsy all the time? And then cultural refers to the cultural context that this character grew up in and is in now. So for instance, did the character grow up in a wealthy family with a stable parental situation, or was his character an orphan who grew up on the streets forced to fend for themselves? Currently, does the character hang around at a bar drinking all day, or does the character spend their time at a major law firm with a bunch of corporate types? A way to make a character instantly more interesting is to work in the idea of a contradiction. Take one trait of this character and then add in something that's on the complete opposite end of a certain spectrum. So for instance, let's say we have a family man who seems very tranquil, leads a very calm life on the surface, but we find out he's also a hitman for the mafia. That contradiction instantly makes that character more interesting because there's a very wide range of humanity inside of this one person. And that creates a lot of room for curiosity. It doesn't have to be as extreme as a hitman example. Let's say we have a hardworking, buttoned-up businesswoman who also happens to play in a punk rock cover band on the weekends. Something like that isn't as extreme, but still gives a sense of a contradiction. So once you have traits for your characters, you're going to want to communicate them to your audience. But what you don't want to do is just dump the information on your audience, saying, hey, here's Jen, she's exactly like this. What you instead want to do is show the characters in action and have the audience come to the conclusion of what they're like while observing them. So don't just say Jen is beautiful, show Jen walking into a bar and heads turning. Don't just say Dave the cop is really strong, show Dave kicking down a door. The same concept applies to personality traits that would stem from mental and cultural dimensions. So for instance, if you have a character who works in a pizzeria, show that character in the middle of a workday. Does the character desperately need the money, or is the character working just to satisfy some requirement from his wealthy father? Is the character a natural leader with other employees, or is the character blowing off requests all the time from coworkers? Does the character flirt with the customers that are coming in all the time, or is the character a bit on the shy side? So the audience is going to get a sense of what this character is like while watching them in action. A technique you could use to more directly show what a character is like under the surface is adding pressure to them. Because when somebody's under pressure, any sort of surface pretenses that they might have tend to fall away and they get more focused. So show that character at the pizzeria during a lunch rush while another character worker calls out sick. So there's a lot of pressure for this character in an understaffed pizzeria to get things done. Do they rise to the occasion and calmly help customers while staying organized, or do they snap, storm out, and quit the job? So that sort of pressure will really help get to the core of what a character is like pretty quickly. There are three major types of protagonists. The first is a character the audience looks down on. You see this a lot in comedy because people like this are pretty easy to laugh at. The second is a character the typical audience member would see eye to eye with. You see this a lot in psychological thrillers and horror. Why? Because typical audience member putting themselves in the shoes of one of these characters makes the terror that this character is experiencing much more relatable and more visceral. The third type of main character is known as an aspirational character, and this is somebody the typical audience member would look up to. You see this a lot in action, where you have a hero that's doing dangerous things, saving people. The type of protagonist in your story relies pretty heavily on the genre you're writing in. So you want to try to stay true to the kind of protagonist you tend to see in your genre. That being said, you could absolutely flip that on its head. So for instance, in a crime story where you usually have a competent detective, you could go for a detective the audience looks down on. A bumbling cop that barely knows how to shoot a gun. That could work, but you need to fully commit to it. You can't put that lead in a crime story that opens up with gruesome murders and the pain of the victims' families. You're going to want to write a more lighthearted comedy with that lead that's maybe about somebody tracking down some funny prize possession. You need your audience to emotionally connect with your hero and follow them as they pursue their goal, which should be a pretty big challenge. So the audience doesn't want to follow somebody that has no skills and can only accomplish a goal by sheer luck. That doesn't make for a dramatic story. So what you want to do is make sure your main character has at least one really solid skill, if not more. This lets the audience know, okay, I'm all right with spending time with this character. I think that they're up for the challenge, and even if they seem outmatched in the beginning, they may somehow figure it out along the way. In a story where you have an aspirational hero, like we talked about, the sort you see in action stories, the skill becomes pretty apparent. This person is usually a great fighter. They might be good with a lot of technological concepts as well. In a story with a hero that the audience sees eye to eye with, even if this person doesn't seem like they're heroic at all, because at the beginning of the story they haven't went on an unexpected challenge yet, at least make them good at something to indicate that there's potential. So maybe they're really good at their job. Even though the job is pretty mundane, they've mastered it. That shows potential when the challenge happens that the hero could rise to it. The concept also holds for the sort of hero that the audience would look down on, like the type in a comedy. For instance, your comedic lead might be a complete mess, just hangs out at a bar all the time, getting drunk, always angering people, getting in their way, screwing things up, whatever it might be. But that hero at the bar plays darts and happens to be really good at darts. It's the only thing that the hero is good at. That small potential that you see in the hero could be grown into something bigger after the hero goes on the challenge later in the story. So maybe the hero takes that focus that they have playing darts and is able to apply it to other aspects of their life as the challenge bears down on them. And this causes this hero to grow through the story. A way to make your main character more interesting is to give the person a secret. So you don't want to reveal the secret right away, but you definitely want to hint that it exists pretty early on in the story. So for example, let's say we have a main character who seems like a pretty typical suburban woman. She goes on vacation with her husband and a few other couples, and on that trip, a strange man comes up to her, calling her by a different name. She gets a bit thrown off by this, though tries to handle it well and tells the guy that he's mistaken. He refuses to accept her answer. The other couple she's with and her husband seem very baffled. The guy then storms off and tells the main character that she's going to be in a lot of trouble. So here we have somebody that may seem pretty typical on the surface, but is actually sitting on some explosive secret, something that caused her to change her name, change her identity, and keep that even from her husband. We don't know what that secret is yet, we just know that it exists. Through this story, we will eventually find out what that secret is and why she changed her name. And that should happen in some sort of a big moment that both helps characterize the lead by painting more of the backstory and moves the plot forward. Like we talked about, allies are characters who try to help your hero achieve their goal. Allies should feel like different types of people from your hero and from each other. You don't want multiple characters in your story to feel like the same type of person. It creates an idea of redundancy. So to make them different, we're going to go back to the 3 dimensions we talked about before: the physical, the mental, and the cultural. For example, let's say we have a military thriller and your main character is a soldier. 2 of his allies are other soldiers in the same unit. Physically, all 3 have a lot in common. They're strong, capable soldiers. But from a mental standpoint, your hero and just one of the allies has something in common. There are strategic types that wait back, assess the battlefield, and ready themselves for the perfect shot. While the 3rd soldier, he's a wild card. The second he sees movement, he starts blasting. From a cultural standpoint, however, your hero and the ally that he shares a mentality with may differ a lot. Your hero grew up poor, while this ally grew up with a lot of money and went to West Point. You don't want variety amongst your characters just for the sake of keeping things different. From a plot perspective, allies that are different sorts of people can help your hero in a different way and keep your plot fresh. For instance, let's say your hero's in a jam. The wild card soldier may throw a grenade into a building, blow a bunch of stuff up, and get your hero out of the jam. Some things may be destroyed in the process, but it would work. The West Point ally, who has family connections in Washington, D.C., might help your hero out of a jam in a different way by tapping into the Secretary of State or some other high-up D.C. insider. At the beginning of your first act, you're going to want to introduce and characterize your hero. Also probably some allies. But at the very start of the first act, there's not necessarily a major conflict going on yet. You might show your characters just going about the status quo. Then something is going to happen that shakes up their world and sets a big challenge up for the hero, which is going to be the main conflict of your story. This is known as the inciting incident. For example, in the boxing story we were talking about earlier in the course, we have a washed up boxer that's going to try to win the World Heavyweight Championship. This story's first act may open with this washed up boxer just going about day-to-day life. So he's washed up, hasn't fought in a while, made some money, but he gambled a lot of it away. He's living off little appearance fees, still has the gambling problem, is doing cocaine a lot, wound up ruining his marriage, and we're seeing this boxer kind of wallowing in this negative existence. Then the boxer finds out he missed his son's birthday party. He said he was going to go, but got stoned, wound up missing it. His ex-wife screams at him, calls him a loser, and tells him he's never going to accomplish anything again for the rest of his life. That would be the inciting incident. Missing the birthday party and getting screamed at. This then forces the boxer to say, you know what? I am in a bad situation. I've got to do something about this. I'm going to start training again. I'm going to win the World Heavyweight Championship, and I'm going to be the fighter that I could have been but never quite was. I'm going to give it my all. I'm still young enough. I have one last shot. I'm going to do this. And now the challenge is set to go win the championship. Your inciting incident is going to create something known as a call to adventure. This is essentially the big challenge that lies ahead in the story, calling your hero to it. In the case of the boxer who was washed up and wants to be a champion, the inciting incident, missing the son's birthday party and getting called a loser, creates a call to adventure that the boxer sets for himself to be a champion. He accepts that call right away. But in other stories, a little bit of extra drama could be added by having your hero initially refuse the call to adventure. For example, let's say we have a crime story and somebody is ritualistically murdered. That's the inciting incident. The cops have no idea who did it, and they go and visit a retired detective, the hero, who has a lot of experience dealing with ritualistic killings. The detective, who's enjoying retirement, who likes being away from the darkness of the job, refuses the call to adventure. Says, nope, I'm good, I'm retired, I hope you guys figure it out. The detective then finds out a little bit later that the victim happens to be the daughter of his ex-partner. Your hero's want is achieving the goal that's set after accepting the call to adventure. Your story could have one want that's unchanging from the beginning of the story, with each act building up to a dramatic question, which all crescendo up to answering the main question at the end of whether or not the hero is going to get that want. For instance, in the boxing story, Act 1 builds up to whether or not the hero could get a trainer. Act 2 builds up to whether or not the hero could get in fighting shape. And then Act 3 builds up to whether or not the hero could defeat the champ while injured. There are other types of stories where the want doesn't necessarily stay the same from the beginning. It morphs and turns into something bigger. For instance, in a military story, the point of Act 1 may build up to finding a terrorist. That's the want for the soldier hero. Find this bad terrorist. That's accomplished by the end of Act 1. However, the hero, when interviewing this terrorist, getting information from him, finds out that others in the terrorist organization are plotting a really big attack. Now, the want changes into something bigger. It's not just about finding one terrorist, it's about stopping a big deadly plot that's being carried out by multiple terrorists. And then in the second act and the third act, we build up to the answer to that. Like we talked about, it's really important your audience is emotionally invested in your hero as they try to accomplish their goal. A way to do this, like we talked about, is giving your hero a skill. But what you also want to do is give your hero something to lose if they fail to accomplish the goal. This creates empathy and lets the audience understand what's at stake. For instance, in the boxing story, if our hero fails to win and become a champion again, he may realize deep down that his greatest times are over, and his fear of never accomplishing anything else again would come true in his life. He has a lot to lose emotionally, and the audience could identify with that. This tactic also allows you to have your hero venture into gray moral territory without losing a connection with the audience. For example, let's say we have a story and the main character is a former criminal who is great at cracking safes. He's retired, He has a daughter. He's leading a peaceful life. Then his daughter gets kidnapped, and the crew of criminals that kidnapped his daughter is saying he has to help them break into a safe and steal a bunch of jewels, and then they'll let his daughter go. So now we have a hero who's forced into crime. During the unfolding of that crime, bad things might happen. The criminals may attack civilians and hurt them. But the audience isn't losing a connection with the hero because they know he's forced to do this to save his daughter. Your hero's want is an external goal that they pursue out in the world. The need, on the other hand, is something that's internal to them, some emotional problem that exists inside of them. Now, this could be something that they're aware of, but don't want to address because it's too painful, or they're not aware of it at all. It's something that festers under the surface of their life. Whatever the case, this need should be hinted at the beginning of the story. The audience should know it exists even if they don't specifically know what the need is. They should know that something is a little off. As an example, let's look at a detective. He may be great at his job, however, his personal life seems to be off. He dates a decent amount of women, however, none of these relationships last. And they all come to an end for the same reason. He winds up starting a fight a bit irrationally and pushing these women away. Something about that seems weird. The need, we later learn, is that the detective lost his wife to an illness, and the pain of that caused him to put a guard up. He doesn't want to get too close to another woman in fear of losing her after they've formed a really deep connection and feeling that anguish again that he felt after he lost his wife. So his need is an internal emotional issue that has to do with him letting down his guard, while his want could be something totally different. Say in this story, the want is finding 3 missing teenagers. In the detective story we were just talking about, the hero has a want of finding 3 missing teenagers and a need of letting his guard down and opening himself up to a personal relationship. 2 very different things. But what you'd want to do as a writer is tie those 2 things together, even if indirectly. So the threads could play off of each other through the story. For example, let's say one of the missing teenagers' mothers happens to have lost her husband a few years ago to illness. Very similar to what happened with the hero. Through the story, as a detective is searching for the missing teens and interviewing friends and family members, he and this boy's mother become pretty close. They speak a lot, they get to know each other. He becomes aware of what happened to her husband. He draws the connection to his own life. And the way she was able to cope with the loss inspires him and changes his way of thinking and gets him to open himself up to what he was doing wrong and what he could possibly do in the future to better his situation. By the end of the story, this could develop even more. The detective lets his guard down, and he and this boy's mother wind up dating. Every act in your story should have at least one major obstacle. But, like we talked about before, to give your story a fast pace, you're going to want to put in a few obstacles per act. This lets you deliver a stream of ups and downs to your audience, building excitement as your hero confronts these obstacles. To add more variety to the obstacles and keep things fresh, you're going to want to change them up in terms of the outcome. Is it an up? Is it a down? In addition to changing up the type of outcome, you also want to change up the intensity. So for instance, in an act, we may have a hero confront an obstacle, leads to a small up. Then he confronts another obstacle, leads to a small down. Might have another sort of story where a hero confronts an obstacle, leads to a small up. Another obstacle leads to another small up. Things are looking good for the hero. And then he hits another obstacle, and that results in a big down. So you want to really shift things up and keep the audience guessing. Whatever the case, the tension should always be present. It should almost feel like your hero is swimming against the current. So though progress may be made, it's done at a challenge. There's a lot of effort. Through your story, your characters, especially your main one, should be forced to make tough decisions. These decisions should have consequences. And they shouldn't just affect the character making them, but others around them. I like including a big, difficult choice at the end of every act. To add impact to this choice, I like making it non-reversible. So if your character is faced with two options and he picks option A over option B, a week later, he can't go, you know what, I messed up, I'm going to go back, I'm going to go with B. Shouldn't work like that. The choice needs to be definitive, no turning back. So for example, in the boxing story we've been talking about, at the end of Act 1, the hero makes a decision to go with an inexperienced young trainer. That decision obviously has consequences, and in this story, we're going to make it non-reversible because there's going to be a deadline leading up to the fight. The hero only has a few weeks to train, and if he commits to a trainer, after the time it takes for them to learn each other's styles and get in a routine, he won't be able to just drop that trainer and pick up a new one. There won't be enough time to get into form before the fight. So whoever the hero picks, he needs to stick with. And he's choosing this inexperienced kid. In terms of that choice affecting others, we could have the hero's brother, who's rooting for him, put a lot of money on the hero winning the fight. Hero's an underdog. If the hero wins, the brother wins a lot, but the brother will lose a lot if the hero loses. The brother is very upset that the hero decided to take a gamble on this inexperienced kid as his trainer. So not only does that choice have consequences for the hero, but his brother as well. Your first act is dedicated to introducing your hero, getting the call to adventure in place, and beginning the conflict. In the second act, you want to start intensifying that conflict. So this is a great place to introduce your main villain. Your hero should go up against multiple opponents through the story, but one of them should stand out, the main villain. Now, in a sports story and other types of stories where the opponent is known from the beginning, you can introduce this villain in the first act. With other types of stories, the opponent may not be revealed through the vast majority of the scenes. This happens a lot in a mystery where the audience doesn't know who is behind the crime until the end. In this case, you still want to characterize your main villain, even if you're not revealing this person's identity. So how do you do that? In a mystery, the villain may be a serial killer. Even though the audience hasn't seen this character yet, the audience could hear the police discuss the actions of this character, how heinous the crimes are, how difficult it is for the villain to get caught. So the audience is getting a sense of what this person is like, what their skills are, even before they know who the person is or even see them interacting in a scene. Like your hero, your villain should have a want in the story. And this want should be in direct conflict with the heroes. For instance, both of them want to win the same boxing match. One of them is a cop who wants to catch a robber. One of them is a robber who doesn't want to be caught. In this contest, you want to stack your odds against the hero. This is going to build drama. For instance, give your villain a more imposing presence than the hero in terms of the traits and skills that would determine the winner of the specific contest that they're both squaring off against each other in. In a sports story, your villain should be bigger and stronger than your hero. In a crime story, the criminal villain should be more cunning and duplicitous than the hero detective. To make a compelling villain, you don't want this character to just be a worthy opponent for your hero in terms of the contest that they're squaring off in. You want to give this character a dark side. Now, the degree to which you give this character dark elements depends a lot on the genre that you're writing in. So for instance, if you're writing a horror story, you really want to go to the extreme. The villain should be a sadistic, murderous killer, and you really want to take that to the furthest reaches. Now, in a romance story, your villain shouldn't necessarily be going around killing people, but you still want to get across the sense of darkness. For instance, maybe the villain has sociopathic traits. They lie and hurt people and don't care about it. Good characterization has to do with how human the character feels. To humanize your villain, you want to give a reason behind their dark side. This creates empathy with the audience. The audience may not agree with the villain's actions, but can at least see where they're coming from. There are various ways you could do this, but two of them, at least to me, stand out. The first is giving your villain some sort of a trauma from earlier in life that creates their behavior in the present. For instance, let's say you have a villain who grew up with an alcoholic stepfather. The stepfather was always beating on the villain's mother, and the villain, as a child, felt helpless. This created a complex for the villain. Later in life, the villain is at a bar, and he sees a guy angrily screaming at his girlfriend. The couple goes outside, the screaming continues, and the guy punches his girlfriend in the face. The villain sees this, snaps, stabs the guy, and kills him. So now you have a villain who's a killer, but the audience could understand where that act came from. The second technique involves giving your villain some sort of a righteous cause that they're fighting for, but the way they're going about it is twisted. For instance, let's say you have a villain whose family was wronged by a corrupt corporation. The villain decides to go up against corporate corruption, But the way the villain does that is twisted. The villain sticks bombs in the mailboxes of corporate executives. A good technique is to tie a bit of this villain's darkness to your hero. Now, your hero should not be as dark as your villain, but it could be effective for your hero to see a little bit of the villain's darkness in themselves. I like to refer to this tactic as a dark mirror. For instance, if your villain is a serial killer who goes around consciously killing people, maybe your hero is a cop who accidentally shot somebody while pursuing a criminal in a crowd years ago and killed an innocent person. The hero never quite got over the sense of guilt. That sense of guilt could directly be tied to the hero's need. So through this story, these threads could play against each other. And coming up against a villain could force the hero to see this darkness out in the world and look inward and confront some sort of a pain that the hero was trying to repress. We already talked about the power of contradictions when creating a character. You're going to want to make sure you lean on this technique when you're painting the picture of what your villain is like. So we just went over how important it is to show the villain's dark side, but you also want to show at least a little bit of some good in the villain. For example, maybe the villain is a sadistic serial killer, but the villain has a pet dog and treats the dog really well. Your hero should have at least 2 opponents in addition to the main villain. You're going to want to introduce these additional opponents by the second act. These additional characters shouldn't just be extensions of the main antagonist. For example, henchmen in a thriller. They should come from different parts of the hero's world and put pressure on the hero in a different way than the main villain while the hero is trying to accomplish the goal. For instance, in a crime story, the main villain would be the criminal, but an additional opponent could be the captain in the detective's police department. The detective is a rebellious, risk-taking cop, and the captain is a very buttoned-up, politically motivated law enforcement officer. The captain is constantly trying to hold back the hero by forcing him into these very stringent regulations. That throws a monkey wrench in the hero's style and holds him back as he's trying to pursue this very crafty criminal. A good technique is to make one of these additional opponents a surprise. You're not going to want to reveal this surprise right away. You're going to want to build it up, but you're going to want to introduce that surprise character early on. For example, in the story we were just talking about, the hero detective may be upset because a piece of evidence that he got goes missing. He thinks that the captain was responsible. The captain doesn't like him, doesn't like the way he goes about his police work, and the detective may have gotten that piece of evidence in a morally gray way. So he assumes the captain is sabotaging him. He goes to his friend's house, he's upset, the detective has a drink, he winds up going to the bathroom, and in a open closet, he notices something peeking out at him. When he goes up for a closer look, he sees that the piece of evidence is in his friend's closet. As the detective is processing this, he hears footsteps, turns around, and notices his friend pointing a gun at him. This is a surprise reveal that the detective didn't see coming, and there could be a lot of impact you could get out of this as a writer if you build it up well. So you can't just stuff a scene like that into your story. You should introduce that surprise opponent earlier on and characterize the person as a very harmless, friendly ally to the detective. The audience is just going to assume this person is going to help, they're not a problem, and then when we eventually see that the friend betrayed the detective, that's going to add a lot more punch to the scene. Another good tactic is to have your hero enter uncharted territory at the beginning of the second act. So remember, this is when you want the hero to be looking up at some big challenge ahead, and the odds should be stacked against your hero. To add to this feeling, you're going to want to take the hero out of their comfort zone and put them in a very unfamiliar dynamic. So there are 3 different ways that I'd recommend doing this. The first is a change of setting. So in the first act, you show the hero going about life in their everyday world. In the second act, you're going to put the hero in a very different place. For example, maybe the cop hero is from a small town rural department, but the killer is off in a big city, and the hero has to go find this killer in an urban environment. The second technique you could use to achieve this is a change of faces. So for instance, the hero is used to working with the same 5 cops in his small department. Now that he's chasing this killer in the big city, he's forced to work with police officers from the big city department. These other cops don't like him. They look down on him. They think he's unsophisticated. There's a lot of room for tension there. The third technique you could use is a change of situation. In this story that we've been talking about, the hero has caught killers in the past, but they were fairly simple in their approaches. This new killer that the hero is chasing through a big city is maybe very good with technology. He could throw off digital forensics very easily, while the hero is not tech savvy at all. So in terms of these 3 approaches, you could focus on one, you could put in 2, or you could put in all 3. It's up to you and the sort of story that you're telling. Your second act should have its own dramatic question. The hero should face obstacles related to this dramatic question, and each obstacle should have an up or a down afterward. In the second act, you really want to amplify the downs. The hero should be in a rough spot, and winning, the ultimate goal, should seem almost impossible. The downs from these obstacles should come together in a way that make achieving the goal even harder for the hero than it was in the first act. For example, in a boxing story, in the first act, the hero thought defeating the heavyweight champ would be hard enough. In the second act, while the hero's training for the fight, he hurts his elbow. In Act 2, you don't want to just make the hero's challenge harder. You want to give the hero more to lose if they fail to accomplish the challenge. This is known as raising the stakes. A good place to do it is around the midpoint of your story. this drives up the tension going ahead into the second half of your story, which is what you want. You want the audience to feel like they're building towards something with the tension ratcheting up. For example, in a crime story, in Act 1, the detective stands to lose his stellar reputation if he fails to catch the killer. Now in Act 2, as a detective is pursuing this killer, the criminal finds out the cop is after him, and the criminal tries to murder him. The detective gets away, but this doesn't mean the criminal is going to stop. So now, in Act 2, going ahead, the cop doesn't just have his reputation to lose, he has his life to lose. Though you want to make things hard for your hero in the second act, by the midpoint of your story, you should give them at least one pretty critical win. So this doesn't mean that they're going to win the main challenge yet, but there's something that hints that they might. For example, in the detective story we were just talking about, in the second act, the criminal tries to shoot the cop. Let's say the criminal puts on a mask, pulls up to the cop at a red light, and tries to shoot him in his car. The cop gets away, doesn't see the face of the criminal, but does notice a partial license plate. So this is a small win that the hero could take going forward into the second half of the story. By the middle of your story, your hero should make some sort of progress towards the external goal. You should also give your hero a bit of progress towards the internal problem, the need. Now, this doesn't mean that the hero is going to overcome the problem of the need, but there should be some sort of indication that the hero is moving in the right direction. For instance, in Act 1, the hero might be totally repressing the need, doesn't even want to confront it. And then by the middle of the story, the hero at least acknowledges they have this problem. Like your first act, your second act should force your main character to make a difficult decision. In the crime story we were just talking about, the hero gets back a partial plate, runs that plate through the DMV database, and notices that there's a dozen potential matches to the killer. With time running out, the hero can't significantly pursue all of these dozen matches. So the hero has to make a difficult choice, picking one at the expense of the rest. So these choices need to be non-reversible and affect, ideally, not just the hero, but other people around the hero. You may have heard of the term 3-act structure. This refers to a story being told in 3 acts. One for the beginning, one for the middle, one for the end. But you don't necessarily have to use 3 acts for your story. Some stories out there are told in 4, some in 5, some even more. So how does this work? In stories with more than 3 acts, the first act tends to function exactly like the first act of a 3-act story. The last act tends to function exactly like the last act of a 3-act story. But there'll be more acts in the middle. So instead of just having one middle act, there might be 2, 3, sometimes more. So why might you do this? If you're telling a story with a lot of different plot threads, you might need more room to explore all of those threads and all of the different characters that make them up. If so, you might want to consider adding more acts to the middle of your story. But only do so if your conflict could escalate in an upward direction through the middle. You don't want a flat middle where there are three different acts with their own dramatic questions, but the conflict is stagnant. You want the conflict, the tension, what's at stake to go up with every act. Regardless of how many acts you go with, right before your final act, I recommend putting in a specific sequence of 3 scenes. The first of these is known as the all is lost scene. And it has to do with the hero running into a devastating setback regarding the external goal. So any progress that's been made towards this goal may seem completely wiped out. So this is the lowest point of the story that the hero has been in regarding the goal. This negativity then leads the hero to a darker place where the pain of the need starts cropping up. So even though the hero may have also made progress on the internal need, pains from that start coming up. This is known as the dark night of the soul scene. The final scene in the sequence happens right after that, and it involves another character pulling the hero out of this darkness. The hero then gets readjusted to the world and feels motivated going into the final act to take on the villain. Before we were talking about a story where a cop's friend turns out to be a surprise opponent who takes evidence away from the cop. Let's stick with that story for this example. In the example, the friend works at the crime lab, and the detective's need is getting over the guilt he feels from killing an innocent person while pursuing a criminal a few years back. So we left off where the friend was pointing a gun at the cop. Tensions are running pretty high. They start screaming at each other. The friend says, "Look, I'm sorry for betraying you, but the killer contacted me, knowing I work in the crime lab, and said, if you don't get rid of this key piece of evidence, I'm going to kill your girlfriend." So now the friend is confessing that he was in a bind. He didn't really know what to do, so he took the piece of evidence away from the lab, but wasn't certain how to proceed from there, so never actually destroyed it, just put it in his closet. But then when the detective showed up unannounced, the friend was taken off guard and didn't better hide the piece of evidence. The friend starts getting upset. The detective won't back down, is insisting the friend handle the situation wrong. The friend gets nervous, thinking that the killer might find out the piece of evidence wasn't destroyed, so grabs it and flushes it down the toilet. A DNA sample hasn't yet been taken from the evidence, so any value that could come out of it is gone. This is the all is lost moment. Any progress the cop made to track down this killer feels totally wiped out. The evidence is gone. Now, the fighting gets a lot worse. They really start going at each other. The cop is stomping towards the friend. The friend threatens to shoot. The cop doesn't stop. The friend shoots and misses. They start wrestling. The cop is able to get the gun off of the friend, shoots him, and kills him. Now, the cop is once again processing the idea of him killing somebody. So the need had to do with the guilt of him getting over somebody else that he killed. It just happened again. The cop is going to hit an emotional low. This is the dark night of the soul scene. The cop is really going to break down, have a difficult time managing all this. During that, he gets a call from an ally, the romantic interest. She comes over, assesses the situation, tries to calm the cop down. She's aware of his need and tells him, look, I know you killed your friend, but it was self-defense. You're not a terrible person. You're not a murderer. The cop starts feeling better, gets clear-headed, and has an idea. He goes into his friend's pocket, takes out his phone, and goes through it because he knows the friend was communicating with the killer. The cop gets a burner phone number for the killer. This could be used via satellite tracking to get a location on the killer. Now the hero is motivated going into the final act to go catch the killer. Your final act is going to build towards your climax scene. This is the scene that's going to wind up answering the question, does the hero achieve the goal? By the end of the climax, we're going to know if the hero was successful with the external want. Since the whole story, not just the final act, is building up to the scene, you're going to want it to be as intense as possible. You're going to really want to wow the audience with this scene. Now, at the end of the scene, the hero doesn't necessarily have to win. Most stories do end with the hero winning, but after this big, intense scene that wows the audience, you could end with the hero in a losing position. That's up to you and the type of story you're telling. I recommend structuring your climax scene in a showdown style. You should have your hero squaring off against your villain in a showdown fashion. Now, certain genres like thriller or action lend themselves to a traditional showdown with guns. But even if you're writing in a different genre, you still want to use this structure. For example, if you're writing a music story, your climax scene might involve two bands in a showdown at a music competition. To add drama to your climax scene, a good tactic to use is something known as a false ending. Here, the hero thinks they've won, but soon they learn they didn't. For example, you have a hero who pushes the villain off a cliff. The hero thinks the villain's dead, but in reality, the villain just gets badly hurt. The villain is able to get into a car, drive up the hill, and slam the car into the hero. Now the hero is also hurt. The showdown gains a dramatic element. hero and villain are squaring off, both injured. They're in a new dynamic, and they have to think on their feet since they're both hurt. And they have to come up with new ways to defeat the other. If you're going to have your hero win in the climax showdown, the hero should win by their own doing. The hero should not be bailed out by luck. For example, if the hero is fighting the villain in the woods and a tree happens to fall down and crush the villain, that's not going to be a good ending. Now, what you could do is have an ally character help the hero in the climax. But if you're going to go that route, the way the ally helps the hero should have to do with something the hero did earlier in the story. For example, maybe the hero taught the specific ally a certain fighting skill. Then in the climax, the ally uses that fighting skill another tactic that could elevate your climax is adding a victory for the hero by some sort of a method that shows the hero's grown in terms of their need. For example, let's say we have a main character whose need involves getting over the death of a family member who was lost in a fire. In the climax, to defeat the villain, the hero has to run into a burning building, facing the fear of fire that's directly tied to the need. The climax should be the most intense scene of your story. As mentioned, this is when the question around the hero's want gets answered. After the climax, the story's going to start winding down. The characters are going to start settling back into their lives. During this wind down period, another very important question gets answered. Does the hero achieve the need? As mentioned, the want and the need in some way should be linked, so the events of the climax should speak to whether or not the hero achieves the need afterward. For example, if the hero wins in the climax, a new positive outlook on life could help the hero overcome the problem that was holding them back with the need. On the other hand, maybe the hero loses in the climax, but still achieves the need. For example, in a boxing story, the hero gets defeated in the big fight at the end. But the need for this hero had to do with mending a bad relationship with his son. The son goes to the fight, has been following the hero as he's been training, and even though the hero loses, the son is proud of his father. This then causes their relationship to end on a positive note, and even though the hero loses in the climax, the hero does achieve the need. Your story's theme is the commentary it's making on the world in general. After your audience finishes your story, the theme is the takeaway that they would have based on the events. Now, since the events in your story revolve around two major questions, does the main character achieve their want, and does the main character achieve their need? The theme is directly tied to the answers to these two questions. What you want to do is make sure your theme is focused and doesn't start drifting and making commentaries about the world that don't have to do with the want and the need. In the boxing story we've been talking about, where the hero loses in the end, but mends his relationship with his son, the theme could be something along the lines of family relationships are more important than personal glory. The hero loses, but he's still happy. He's happier than he would have been if he won the fight because his relationship with his son is in a good spot. Once you have an idea of what your acts look like, your story should really start coming together. Here are 10 writing techniques that can elevate the drama in your acts even more. A story question is any question the audience really wants to know the answer to while they're taking in a story. For example, let's say you have a character who's renting out a cabin. The renter comes over, the owner gives the renter the key, says, have a great time, but whatever you do, stay out of the attic. That's a story question. The audience is going to want to know what's in the attic. Keep in mind, a story question is different than a dramatic question, which we talked about during our lessons on acts. Suspense means making your audience wait for a piece of information it wants to know. Suspense is very much related to story questions. Every time a story question is raised, suspense is kicked off as the audience waits for the answer. It's good to make the audience anticipate the answers to story questions for as long as possible. This could be over multiple scenes, maybe even multiple acts. Suspense also involves information the audience wants within an individual scene. For example, a character is flying a helicopter in a storm and is coming close to a mountain. The audience is going to want to know if the character gets past the mountain safely. Even within that scene, though the audience is going to have the answer by the end of the scene, extending the time you take to give the audience that answer ups the drama and makes the audience more invested in that answer. A cliffhanger involves the audience about to get a piece of information it wants to know, and then the scene ending just before they do. A tactic that's often used with cliffhangers is cross-cutting, where you end a scene right before the audience gets a piece of information it wants to know, then you go to a completely different scene, then come back to the scene where the audience is waiting for an answer. This back and forth extends the anticipation. We talked about this before when we went over characterization. When you want the audience to know what a character is like, don't just dump a bunch of information on them. Show the character behaving and and have the audience come to the conclusion of what they're like. This concept, known as show versus tell, can be applied anywhere in your story where you describe something. For example, if a character's apartment is hot, don't just say the apartment is hot. Show the sun blazing through the window. If two events in your story are connected and the audience could reasonably make that connection on their own, you shouldn't tell the audience there's a link. That could slow down your story. For example, let's say you have a character who doesn't have a lot of money and is a criminal, and that character in one scene is walking around a high-end car dealership. You then show that character a few scenes later driving around in one of the cars from the dealership. You don't need to tell the audience the character stole the car. The audience could come to the conclusion on their own without you slowing down the story to get that information in. There are two variations to this. The first is when a character knows something, the audience doesn't. For example, a character reads an email, seems shocked, but the audience doesn't yet see what's in the email. The second variation is the opposite. The audience knows something that a character doesn't. For example, the audience knows the killer is hiding in the back seat of a car. A character is walking over to that car and has no idea the killer's inside. Like we discussed, your character should be forced to make tough choices through your story. This is known as internal conflict. To up the drama, you should show the stress a character is under while they're weighing one of these decisions. For example, you could have a character who's hardly slept a few nights in a row. A twist is a major surprise that twists the events of the story in a different direction. Now, a good twist shouldn't just come out of nowhere. You want to misdirect your audience. You want to give your audience clues that this surprise could have happened, but you want to really bury those clues far from plain sight. For example, let's say we have a twist where a certain character is revealed to be working with the main villain. If we know the main villain is from a certain city, and that's very apparent through the story, early on, this character who's part of the twist could very casually mention that they went to college in that city. If a certain element in your story plays a critical role in a scene, you're going to want to introduce that element beforehand, even if it's in a simple, casual way. This lets the audience know the element is part of the story's world, and when it's used later, it feels more natural. Showing the element is known as planting it, and payoff is the part of the story when the element is used. For example, let's say we have a character who's at home and an intruder breaks in. The character is able to fend off that intruder by grabbing a baseball bat out of the closet and whacking the intruder over the head. If the character did that out of nowhere, it might feel a bit unnatural. Earlier on, if you showed the character coming home from baseball practice and putting the bat in the closet, the problem would be solved. A ticking clock is a deadline on some sort of action a character or a group of characters needs to complete to avoid something bad. For example, let's say you have a character who gets a notice from his bank that says he has 30 days to come up with a bunch of money or else he's going to lose his house. That's a ticking clock. The character has 30 days. Through the story, we're going to follow the character trying to come up with the money, and as the days pass, the pressure is going to build up. Every act in your story should have at least one major obstacle related to that act's dramatic question. For instance, in the boxing story we've been talking about, Act 1's dramatic question is, can the boxer find a trainer? The first major obstacle the boxer runs into is the alcoholism of his former trainer. Though these major obstacles play a big role in your story, they shouldn't be the only obstacles in your story. In fact, every single scene needs its own obstacle. Every scene needs a subject character who has a specific intention for that scene and a specific obstacle that's preventing that intention from getting carried out. Often, the subject character is going to be your hero, and these obstacles could be the major obstacles that refer to the act's dramatic question. But they don't all have to be major obstacles. A lot of scenes in a story involve the lead up to one of these major obstacles and then the aftermath after one of these obstacles is confronted. For example, in the boxing story, after the hero meets with his old trainer and sees that he's an alcoholic and he won't be able to do the job, the hero then sets out to find a different trainer. The hero's intention in the following scene could be putting together a list of possible candidates to be his trainer. The obstacle is the fact that the hero has been out of boxing for a few years, so he doesn't necessarily know which trainers that are out there are the best, which ones are terrible. He's not really certain. Maybe we could show the hero meeting with an ally to try to overcome this obstacle. Your hero may not be in various scenes in your story. A scene subject character might be the villain, or maybe the hero's romantic interest, or one of many other characters in the story. Whatever the case, each scene needs one subject character, an intention, and an obstacle. Now, these obstacles might not always involve the dramatic question of the act, which is based around the hero. For example, in a scene where the villain is the subject character that the hero is not in, the villain might be plotting some scheme that the hero doesn't even find out about until the next act. So you do have flexibility when you're writing scenes within an act. Not every single obstacle has to tie into that act's dramatic question, especially when the subject character isn't the hero. after a scene's subject character confronts the scene's obstacle, the scene should have an outcome that's an up or a down for that character, and that up or down should change the character's trajectory in the story. Now, lead up scenes and aftermath scenes may have pretty minor ups or downs, but they're still important because they move the story forward. For example, in the scene we were talking about before, where the boxer is trying to put together a list of potential trainers, the outcome of a scene may be a piece of paper with a few names on it. Now, that's not a major dramatic event in the story, but it's definitely a clear up. It moves the story forward. Before the scene, the character didn't have a list. After the scene, the character has a list. There was a change, and that change propels the story forward. Though each scene should revolve around an obstacle, you can add pieces of your story into a scene that don't have anything to do with that obstacle or the scene's intention. Earlier, we discussed various characterization and plot techniques. These somehow need to show up in your scenes. The scene is the layer of your story that the audience actually takes in. So anything involving characterization, plot development needs to show up in a scene somewhere. For instance, let's say we have a scene with the subject character of a hero cop. The intention is to arrest a criminal. The obstacle is going to be the criminal running when the cop shows up at the criminal's apartment. You also want to characterize this cop in the scene and his partner. So, on the way to the criminal's apartment, when the cops are riding in the police car, they could have a conversation. You could get those character development tactics into the scene during this conversation. This conversation doesn't have to have anything to do at all with the intention or the obstacle of the scene. The cops could talk about anything. They could talk about music, a really bad night the partner had the night before, whatever it might be. The four main elements of a story are characters, plot, theme, and emotion. Emotion tends to be what audiences are signing up for when they want to take in a story. If you ask somebody what their favorite book or movie is, chances are that answer is going to be based on the emotional experience the person had with the book or movie. So as a writer, you really want to make sure your scenes deliver an emotional impact. There is a wide range of emotions your scenes could get into. You want to really think about the type of story you're telling and the sorts of emotional reactions you'd want your audience to have within your scenes. Certain emotional reactions you want your audience to have aren't isolated to the specific scenes where the audience is supposed to experience the emotion. You're going to want to build up to those scenes for added impact. For example, let's say you have a scene where a soft-spoken character stands up for himself against a tough, abrasive character. That scene would have a lot more impact if you showed a scene earlier in the story where the soft-spoken character is taken advantage of by the abrasive character and doesn't do anything about it. The audience could then see that character go from a position of weakness to a position of strength.